In this lesson, we are going to look into integration of IIS web services and how some services handle Kerberos authentication. In configurations where an application calls a service on another application to serve an end-user request, we need to configure delegation between the mid-tier applications so that they can interact on behalf of an end-user. Technically, there is no limit for a number of hops, regardless of whether the request is directed toward backend services or it hops between mid-tier services to fetch data from their corresponding backend services. A service endpoint identity is used to authenticate the service. After the client initiates a communication to an endpoint and the service authenticates itself to the client compares the endpoint identity value with the actual value the endpoint authentication process returned. If they match, the client is assured it has contacted the expected service endpoint. Let's see the requirements for specifying service endpoint identity in Windows Communication Foundation, Web API, and .NET Core services. If a Windows Communication Foundation Service 1, which runs in Application 1, makes a call to a Service 2, which runs in another application, we need to specify the target or endpoint identity using its SPN. Otherwise, by default, the UPN of the service account which runs the target service will be used as the target service identity, and Kerberos authentication will fail, with bad option error. If the service is running under the local system, local service, or network service account, an SPN is generated by default, because those accounts have access to the computer's SPN data. If the service is running under a different account, Windows Communication Foundation generates a UPN. So if we run a service under a domain account, we need to register an SPN for it and configure Windows Communication Foundation to publish that SPN to the service's clients through its metadata. Here is a sample endpoint identity configuration. Web API assumes that authentication happens in the host, that is, in IIS. Authentication logic can also be put in an HTTP message handler, which is going to examine the HTTP request and set the principal. An HTTP module sees all the requests that go through ASP.NET, while a message handler only sees the requests that are routed to Web API. It's not possible to specify endpoint identity for Web API services. Windows authentication relies on the operating system to authenticate users of ASP.NET Core applications. ASP.NET Core doesn't implement impersonation, and all the requests are processed under the application pool or process identity. If the application should perform an action on behalf of a user, we can use the methods Windows Identity run impersonated or run impersonated async in a terminal inline middleware in Startup Configure. ASP.NET Core 3 and later can only target .NET Core. The map_get method is used to define an endpoint, which can be selected by matching the URL and HTTP method, or executed by running the delegate. There are no options for specifying endpoint identities.